The Big Light presents
It is that kind of when you have a new baby, everybody wants to come and see you and everybody comes to visit. But that wears off. It was sort of everybody was there and then they were gone. Husband goes back to work and then it's just you there holding the baby.
My name is Halina Rafai and this is the A Sonic Hug podcast. Over the coming episodes, you're going to hear the voices of people from different walks of life who deal, experience and battle mental health issues. In this episode, I meet Lyn-Marie, now a nurse and single mother living in Glasgow. I've known Lyn-Marie for around 18 years now because of our love of music. Like most of the people I know who I've spoken to about their stories on this podcast, I didn't know the extent of how bad things were for her over the years. Here she talks about her battle with postnatal depression, but also the domino effect of what happened afterwards. There are some graphic descriptions surrounding birth and discussion around suicidal ideation that some people might find difficult to listen to. This is Lyn-Marie's story.
Well, I've suffered from some form of depression in kind of varying degrees with each of my children that I've had. The one that really stands out is after my second child. Now, that was a fairly traumatic birth, a very difficult birth. And I think it's quite common that in more traumatic or difficult births that women have these more pronounced episodes of postnatal depression. So for me, it kind of started with that day 3, this kind of typical 3 days postpartum that women have these very kind of tearful episodes and it's hormonal. It's very normalized. Everybody's told, no, you expect that. That's normal. But for me and my son then, there was this bond that I never had with any of my other children. It was it's difficult to explain. Obviously, mums have bonds with their children and you expect to have a bond. But with my second son, this bond was so intense that I could not be separated from him. And in a lot of ways, I couldn't bear other people touching him or, I didn't want anybody else anywhere near him. If he needed anything, I had to do it. It was me that had to change the nappies, that had to feed him. And that's not massively unusual, but it became a prolonged thing and it went on over a much longer period of time. The spells of being really tearful and being really down and feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I just was not up to the job of being a parent. Despite having this really strong bond that, I couldn't bear anybody else being near him, I still always felt I wasn't good enough for him. Now, I think my family looking outside initially, this is normal. This is what women go through. This is a normal part of that kind of postnatal stage. And the cracks started to appear when I stopped really looking after myself. I've talked about my experience in bits and pieces when it's been pertinent to a conversation, but I've never actually told the story before. Cracks started to appear in my relationship. I was married at the time. That was my first husband. And I actually, for a long time, could not bear him anywhere near me either, which coincided, in fact, with us having been together for 7 years. And that, I think, was written off by a lot of my family as well as 7-year itch. 7-year itch, it's typical. You'll get over it. It's fine. He's good. He's a good man. There was a lot of things kind of culminated. And I don't know if postnatal depression is what ended my marriage. I don't know if he was the kind of catalyst. There's lots that I don't understand about how I felt and how things were going back then. I'd had spoken to my GP. Now, my GP at the time was a lovely, lovely man, very sympathetic. And I wouldn't mind betting you've seen GPs like this. They turn to face you, they lean forward, their hands are on their knees and they're very sincere and their voice changes and they want to show how supportive they're being. And then their answer is, we'll give you some antidepressants. So, which for me at the time was Prozac. Now, I felt really poorly on the Prozac. For me, it kind of culminated in after the initial sort of 4-week period, and I didn't feel any better at all. The side effects were knocking me for six. I had a constant thirst and a constant sweat, and I felt awful. And I went back to the GP after the initial period, and all he did was just put up the dose. The difficulty being that, yes, he could refer me for counselling, but it could take up to 2 years to access anything because I wasn't suicidal. Yes, the GP support was there, but it wasn't the right kind of support. It wasn't what I needed at the time. Now, my ex-husband, I need to try and be very careful how I word this, because how I would explain it would make him seem like a really bad person. And I don't know if that's my judgment clouding it. However, my ex-husband would go and speak to my family about how I was. The focus was never on that I was suffering with depression or that I was really struggling, but it was, she's not doing any housework. She's not looking after the kids, and she's not looking after herself. She's not doing anything. She's on her computer all the time. She's in chat rooms all the time. It was a really difficult relationship with me and my family at the time. And part of it, I think, I could have gone and spoken to them. I think that's their viewpoint on it, was that I should have gone and spoken to them. I actually did go and speak to my mum, but she never mentions this anymore. I think this has kind of been wiped from the memory banks because it doesn't suit that agenda. That I'd spoken to my mum and said, look, I'm not happy in this marriage anymore and I need to get away. And my mum said, oh, well, we can't have any of you here because we just don't have the room to keep you. So there was no practical help. There was no talking. There was no listening. It was just cut dead. At one point, I think I had all the family around at my house, and I was trying to explain to them how I felt about things, and they promised me, yeah, we'll support you. We'll see what we can do to help you. And it was support that never materialised. My dad at the time was suffering really quite badly with depression. I've always said depression can make you very selfish, and not in an intentional, like, I'm just going to worry about me kind of way, but it twists that way of thinking that you can only see that darkness that you're surrounded by. You don't see that effect that it has on other people. So I think my dad found it difficult to have any empathy with me because he was going through so much himself. So going back to what I started saying before, my ex-husband at the time was speaking to my parents an awful lot, and that completely obliterated their relationship with me for really quite a long time. I do feel a lot that, maybe I should have made more effort, but shoulda, woulda, coulda. I think my whole family can look back and go, we should have done this differently. And having spoken to them since, I think they all agree, yeah, we could have done this differently if only we'd understood more at the time. I think this kind of normalization of this baby blues feeling that you get, I don't know that that's necessarily harmful. And I don't think there is enough focus on postnatal women that this can be a problem, but you can always talk to people. There's things you can do. Yes, it can be a problem to have this kind of postnatal blues feeling, but I think we need to stop normalizing that as, well, that's just what happens and you'll be all right again in a few days. It's too easy then to fall into that trap of going, well, this is how I'm supposed to feel. People will write it off. They will minimize it, that it's not important. If you've had a baby, you should expect to feel that way. My pregnancy itself was really uneventful. Nothing, happened untoward. Everything progressed really well. There was an episode kind of late on in the pregnancy where I hadn't felt the baby move for quite a while, and I was sort of panicking a little bit. And straight up to the hospital to the antenatal department. And as soon as I sat in the waiting room waiting to be seen, I started feeling the kicks and everything. But that was really the only worry that I'd had during that pregnancy. Now, I had miscarried before that pregnancy. He was a very much wanted baby. We were trying, I think, to get pregnant for around about 2 years. A desperately, desperately wanted baby, but a completely uneventful pregnancy. The birth itself... Now, I'd had an emergency cesarean section with my first baby. Advice I'd received from midwives at the time was, no, you can try and have a normal delivery after a cesarean section. The assumption had always been that if you've had one section, you will only have sections after that. it was, yes, I was given a choice, but it never felt like a choice. It was always, no, come on, you can do it. That's the best thing for you, and it's the best thing for your baby. You should really try it. You should really give it a go. To the point even where I was up in labour, I was saying, I really wanted a section. Like, I really want a section. No, you don't need a section. Come on, you're going to get through this and you're going to be absolutely fine. I get why they do that, because it is the recovery from a normal delivery, if everything goes to plan, is easier than a section. But my labour went on for about 36 hours in the end. My contractions would start and then they would stop and then they would start and then they would stop. Now, I was what they used to call then a trial with scar, what they now call, I think it's VBAC, of vaginal birth after cesarean. But it was a trial of scar, basically your scar tissue that you have from your previous cesarean section. It could be liable to break down. So they kind of have to monitor you very closely. So I was in the hospital for all this time labouring. I didn't labour at home for very long, very, very prolonged. So having to have a drip in to speed up my contractions. Then they were too fast. So it was another drip to slow down the contractions. And it got to the point where I was ready to deliver, was fully dilated, and baby got stuck. They had to deliver him with what they call the ventouse, which is the suction cup on the back of their head, and basically suck him out. So when he was born, he had a massive, massive bruise on the back of his head. They delivered him right onto my stomach, and then wasn't even seconds before they'd taken him away again. And I couldn't see him. There was sort of midwives and doctors everywhere in the room, and I didn't know what they'd done with him. And I was kind of panicking a bit, but I really didn't feel very well. And it turned out I was hemorrhaging. So that was why I hadn't felt well. The baby himself, I hadn't heard him cry either. And it was only reading my maternity notes after. They used to give you a big yellow book where I gave birth in Bristol, and it had all your kind of maternity notes all the way through your pregnancy, through the birth, and then through sort of post-delivery. And it was only reading in the notes after he was born that they'd actually had to fast bleep the paediatrician because he wasn't breathing. And they had to, I don't think they had to resuscitate him as such. I think they had to use suction to clear his lungs out and everything to get him breathing. And it was little things like that. Now, I had a fantastic student midwife in with me while I was labouring. She was amazing. And another midwife that was her mentor, whose name I still remember to this day. She would never know me, but I know her name was Kate Horwood. Her name will stick with me forever. Now, she was amazing, but her time's very limited, as all health professionals are. So she was as supportive as she could be. So all this kind of, the stress around the birth and all the rest of it, what had also happened is because I'd had the ventouse, they were going to do an episiotomy, so sort of where they give you a cut to kind of open your vagina a bit more to help deliver the baby. But what actually happened was I tore, and I had what they call a 3rd degree tear. So everywhere, split, vagina to rectum, completely split, and had to go down to theatre anyway. So I was in theatre with a spinal block epidural that I would have had if I'd had the section. So my recovery actually was no better than if I'd had a section. I ended up with the same recovery, the same pain, the same issues after. It was traumatic in that sense, yeah. I have 4 boys. Ashley is still the most perfect little baby I have ever seen in my life. He was just so beautiful when he was born. And all babies are beautiful, especially your own babies. But this boy, he was just perfect. Even with this big bruise on the back of his head, he was just absolutely stunning. And once he was given to me, I couldn't leave him alone. I just couldn't stop cuddling him. I remember my mum and dad coming to visit in the hospital, and my older boy, Robert, at the time, would have been 3, no, a little bit older than 3. And he came in. Now, I hadn't told my parents if we had a boy or a girl until they came, because we wanted Robert to be the first to find out if he had a little brother or a little sister. So Robert came in first, and he jumped up on the bed with me, and he was sort of sitting next to me on the bed while we were both cuddling Ashley. And now when I look back at photos of that, you can see, I hadn't noticed it at the time, but I'd had all these nurses and midwives tell me, we're going to check your bloods again. We're going to check your bloods. I'm like, but why? You're anemic. And I was like, I've always been anemic. They're like, no, you really look poorly. You really look anemic, and we need to check and see if you need a transfusion. And I'm just whatever, just get on with it. Not bothered. And it's only now when I look back at photos, I have never, ever seen anybody that pale in my life. So that new baby bubble, it was lovely. And then you sort of have your visits from the midwife for a couple of weeks after birth. And then after that, it's the health visitor that comes out and sees you every few weeks. And like I say, this day 3 time where you're told to kind of expect to feel tearful. This was probably on about day 6, something like that. I'd had a prolonged stay in the hospital after everything that had happened. And the midwife that came out to visit me and visit the baby, she'd asked how I was, and I burst into tears. And I said, but he's just so beautiful. I just love him so much. I've never heard of women saying that before. I've heard lots of, am I good enough? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I've never heard of a woman saying he's so beautiful before. But I had my parents sort of coming to visit, my sister, and I did have lots of kind of support in those first few days. They were coming and they were making tea and all the rest of it. So it is that kind of, when you have a new baby, everybody wants to come and see you and everybody comes to visit. But that wears off when they're not new anymore. And I get that, we all have lives. It's part of what happens. You don't want to be just following a new baby around for 18 years. But it was sort of, everybody was there and then they were gone, if that makes sense. It's just, we had all that kind of support, and then husband goes back to work, and then it's just you there holding the baby. I think I realised I needed help. I think people noticed I wasn't quite myself, but it was me that kind of came to the realisation. Nobody intervened. Nobody said, I think you need to go and speak to somebody. It was after it'd been going on for a long, long time that I just felt completely disassociated from everything that was going on around me, apart from my baby and my older son, who was going to school at the time. I was very aware that my life was getting up, looking after my baby, getting my son to school, picking him up from school and bringing him home again. That my life was an endless round of washing and dishes and drudgery. It became so grinding. Now, I was kind of, I'd had this before because I'd had an older child. I was used to, that's what your life is when you have kids at home, especially when they're really small. But I was at a point where I went, I can't live this life anymore. I don't want to be in this situation anymore. I love my kids so much and I want everything good for them, but I can't live like this. I got to the point where I realized that this wasn't how I felt with the first one. This was something completely different. This was something dark, and this was something really heavy. And it was something that I couldn't shake off. I used to spend a lot of time going to visit my mum and just going over to see her and having a chat and drinking tea and watching telly together. But when my son started school, I couldn't do that anymore. His school wasn't near where my mum was, so I couldn't just go in and see my mum. So I didn't have that same, I'm going to call it a social life because it was the closest I had to one. But I never had that same backup. I never had that same place to vent, that same place to be listened to. I was very much on my own, an awful lot. My husband at the time used to work and he was a bus driver, so he would work strange hours and, he could be out 6 a.m. or he could be out in the afternoon and not home till well after midnight. It would become the kind of thing that I could go days without actually speaking to another adult person. And even when, my husband at the time, even when he'd go out to work all day and he would come home and he'd have an early finish, he would go out for a run or, he'd set up a gym in a spare room and he would just go and work out. So even when he was home, he wasn't there. And I found that very, very difficult to take. And then, of course, your friends are going out and doing things and, they're enjoying themselves. And because I was still quite young at the time as well. I was only 23 when Ashley was born. I felt like I was missing out on so much in life and that life was just passing me by and I was left behind by it all. That was when I went to speak to my GP. I've never believed that throwing medication at everything is the answer to everything. That is literally the only resource that is available, because The waiting lists for counselling, for any kind of talking therapy, was looking at 2 years. 2 years is a long time to wait for it. He did say he would speak to the health visitor that was making regular visits. But again, they come out and they sit with you for 20 minutes, maybe. I always kind of felt it was my situation that needed to be fixed, rather than giving me medication that wasn't going to change the situation I was in. I have actually had somebody ask me the question, do you think you shouldn't have had kids then? And no, I've never felt that. I think all parents at times have these kind of episodes where they go, oh my God, if I didn't have kids now, I could be doing this and I could be doing that. And I think that's entirely normal, and I don't feel any guilt for that. So the turning point for me came when I hit rock bottom, which for me was I didn't actually want to be around my family anymore, because this difficult relationship that had developed from everything that had happened. I actually do think if I'd stayed there, I wouldn't be here today. I would not be alive today. This is the hard bit, because as much as I've just said, no, I don't resent having kids, I did pack up and I moved to another part of the country. And my ex-husband now, he is still down in the south of England, and that's where my older 2 children live. So for me, as much as I regret bitterly that they haven't grown up with me, I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't left at that point. The relationship I was in had become so toxic. Now, I'm sure, there's other sides to the story, and maybe that is my fault because of how poorly I was at the time. I don't think that is 100% the case. The turning point in itself didn't then come for a couple of years. I kind of went into a bit of self-destruction over the next couple of years. And I think, looking back, there was lots of alcohol. There was lots of men. There was lots of behavior that I really should not have been getting involved in. But I was putting my own health and my own safety at risk an awful lot. I did move around a bit. I'd spent some time living in the north of England. I spent some time living in Aberdeen. I've now moved to Glasgow. I think how I got out of that was really I was burned out. I got to the point I couldn't live that life anymore. I was exhausted. So I'd be out all night and then roll into work the next morning. And, that got to a point where that becomes exhausting, and that becomes a different, all these coping mechanisms, they just eventually they stop working because they are so destructive. I did get to that point where I had to say, no, enough's enough. And kind of at the tail end of that, I met my second husband. We lived with his parents for a little while and then moved out and got a flat. And we were both sort of working through temping agencies and things at the time. We both lost our jobs around about the same time. I was pregnant with my third son, with Charlie at the time. So again, it was kind of that, oh my God, we need to do something to get out of this now. And I remember we were living in a flat in Kennishead that was for homeless people. Probably the lowest either of us has been before or since. And we kind of sat, and there's me washing baby clothes, getting ready because I'm about to go into hospital and have another baby. And we had one tea bag and a big teapot. And we just had to use the one tea bag in the big teapot. And we made that pot of tea last the full night because it was all we had. And I remember sitting there going, do you know what? This is as low as it gets, but I'm actually happy. I have somebody with me and I've got another baby coming and my life can't get any worse. And, things start coming together. We ended up in a permanent flat and taking jobs and things and, trying to get work going. And it was actually then that I decided I don't have a job. I have nothing to lose by going to university. I'm on benefits now. So if I go to university, I'm not going to worsen my situation. And I think if you work full time, stop and go to university, you lose so much money. Whereas if you're on benefits and decide to go to university, you actually don't lose anything. And I'd been talking about becoming a nurse and becoming a midwife for so many years. And it just never been the right time or a time when I was financially able to do it. So for me, really, where things started to pick up again and I started to feel productive again was when I decided to go back to university and become a nurse. And that's been me since. I don't feel that I will ever recover fully from my issues with postnatal depression and kind of ongoing depression that kind of roll on and on from there. But I do feel I can spot it. I can see when these things are happening to me, and I know the things that I need to do to fix it. I've tried all sorts of medications. I've had Prozac and I've had citalopram and I've had sertraline. And for me, they don't work. They do kind of have an effect, but for me, it is a numbing effect. And that numbing effect to me is far worse than feeling down, than feeling sad, than feeling like I want to cry all the time, than feeling like I don't want to be here. That numb effect for me is horrible because you feel nothing. And I've always been a very kind of emotional person, and I've been an empathetic person, that to me, not being able to feel, that was horrendous. So as things stand, I don't take any medication at the moment, apart from anything I may take when I'm struggling with anxiety. To actually have a job where, I've had to get a degree to get there. So that's an accomplishment. I've made progress in my career. I started as a staff nurse, I've been a charge nurse, and I've been a deputy manager in a care home. And that's achievement. But to me, that kind of, I can walk into my work and I know everybody there. I know what everybody needs. And if something's not quite right, I know how I can go in and how I can go and put things right, or how I can go and make things better. And that's been such a huge thing for me, because it becomes a focus. The people I look after are a family in themselves. It's their home that I go to work in. It's a privileged job, I think, that we get to see and we get to be involved in the most personal areas of somebody's life. Lots of my work has been palliative care, and it is an absolute honour to get to be able to do that, to be invited in at that point. And that's really been, having that kind of purpose again, and being a caregiver both at home and when I go to work. It's actually feeling useful and feeling productive that has lifted a lot of what I felt then away from me. Any advice I could give to any woman in that situation is, you're not failing. You're not letting people down, and you are not on your own. You aren't the only person to feel like this. And there will be somebody that has done this before. I think the hardest thing is as women in these situations, we want to punish ourselves because we don't feel we're good enough. And I would always tell people, don't punish yourself. There's things that, that I did in that spell that I don't know that I necessarily forgive myself for, or that I don't want to sit and make excuses for it. But I have to say, I was not well. And had I been well, they are not decisions I would have made. And when you're not well, you don't necessarily do things the way you would normally do them. I think women in general are kind of given this, you just suck it up and get on with it. This is how life is. But then I think when you're a mother and you suddenly have that responsibility for another person, your focus then goes on to that person. It's just so important to have time for yourself as well, to speak to other adults. I don't like telling people to reach out, because I think that's so hard to do when you are in that space. When your head is in that space, it's so hard to say, I need help here. There does need to be this kind of focus on, people need to be able to approach a subject and say, look, I don't think you're very well. And do you want to talk about it? Maybe not in those words, but if you were to see somebody else struggling, would you then go and speak to them? There's too much guilt involved with being a mum as it is. And, we all sit and wonder, am I doing this right? Am I doing the right thing? Have I done the right thing by them? To sit and be cruel to yourself and punish yourself by thinking you're not good enough, by letting that spiral continue, it's just doing more and more harm.
That was Lyn-Marie's story. I want to thank her implicitly. This is one of those episodes that's going to stay with me for several reasons. Firstly, I'm not a mother. It was a decision I made some time ago, so listening to her account is something I'm so grateful for. For someone to be so honest about something that I can't fully relate to is an opportunity to learn, but also another moment to develop true empathy for women experiencing what she has gone through. The traumatic birth is something I want to begin with and try to understand for myself following her story. A connection between mother and child is something that I think for many reasons goes beyond comprehension. I realise all relationships are not the same due to varying situations if you don't want to keep a child, for example, but the fundamental act of growing a child within you is profound. So for Lyn-Marie to have a complete fixation and incomparable love for her child is understandable. If anything were to harm that being, then I suppose all of us on some level can try to appreciate what that would be like. And I think that level of emotion is where we should begin. Internally, you've shifted. It's rooted itself and perhaps created something new within you. So to have that swayed or anything affect it will maybe change the course of other things you experience. When Lyn-Marie talks about how there was a burst of activity and visits when she first had her baby and then it sloped off, including her then husband returning to work, that all or nothing is something else that will no doubt affect us mentally. I've heard some people describe it like a dream and then reality sets in of how hard it can be, especially when you hit the Groundhog Day effects of life. Similar to my last episode with Pedro highlighting the importance of relationships, Lyn-Marie also didn't have tangible relationships. There was isolation, and whilst she may have created a bubble around her and her children, the adult human connection was absent, leaving her, in her words, unable to vent or have anyone listen to her. But there were signs. She says she stopped looking after herself and shut down. And it's interesting when she says that her husband spoke to her family, but instead of showing empathy and kindness by telling them she was struggling, there was a focus on the everyday acts of material routine like washing. The barriers being that Lyn-Marie couldn't say what she was experiencing, but also her husband didn't ask how she was or if she was okay. Would that have changed things? I don't know. I think we also have to be mindful that her husband might not have known how to approach the situation. This is yet another episode that someone has said that they were put on medication by their doctor and that waiting lists for therapy were too long. Granted, this took place in Bristol at the time, but there has been a common theme over this whole podcast when it comes to the UK in general. Yes, some people require medication. I know lots of people who've managed to turn their lives around because of it, but I do question the second time that Lyn-Marie went to her doctor and was given a higher dose. Could something else have been done? We say this time and time again, there are fundamental issues with our health system, and that's down to the government. When is this going to change? Could Lyn-Marie have gone down a different path if she had had access to talking therapy? We will never know. I think it's really important what she says about the term baby blues and how it's become normalised. I personally have a real issue with the phrase as it almost sugarcoats the complete darkness that women can experience with postnatal depression. But I want to note what she says about how women are expected to feel like that. As she says, it minimises feelings, and that's a problem. Self-destruction is a common thing for many who have struggled with mental health, and this is something I can relate to. Coping mechanisms get out of control, and I'm so sad that Lyn-Marie went through this. But I can understand why. Everything failed her. There's so much more I want to say, but I will end on the note of kindness. The absence of kindness in this story is apparent on numerous levels. Kindness to her as a mother, partner, and relative. Kindness to her as a patient. Kindness to herself. I am glad that she now shows herself kindness, and that has come full circle with her job, as is the case with many people who want to give back. That is a remarkable feat for someone, and the sign of true kindness. If you have experienced or are experiencing anything described in this episode, you will find support information in the text to accompany this podcast. A Sonic Hug is recorded, edited and produced by me, Halina. We are also part of Scotland's podcasting network, The Big Light. Until next time, deep breaths.
From the Big Light Studio,